The slap cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Every fork froze. Every coffee cup stopped midair.
How are
Every
the
single
pancakes,
person in
sweetie?
that room
They're
held their breath
yummy.
because they all just watched
How's
a
your
grown
coffee?
man walk up to
Perfect.
a quiet father eating breakfast with his little girl and slap him across the face like he was nothing. But here's what Mark Anderson didn't know. That man sitting there, that calm, still quiet man with a faded tattoo on his forearm, hadn't flinched, not even a little, and that should have told Mark everything. Have you ever been provoked by someone who had no idea who they were messing with? Drop a comment and tell me your city. Robert Williams had learned a long time ago that silence was its own kind of armor. Not the silence of weakness, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had seen enough of the world's noise, the kind of noise that got people killed, to know that quiet was precious. Quiet was earned. Quiet meant you were still standing when everything around you had already fallen apart. He sat in his usual booth at the Pine Valley Diner, the one near the window, the one where the morning sun came in at a low angle and turned Emily's hair into something that looked almost golden. He noticed things like that now. He hadn't always, but since Melissa passed, he noticed everything about his daughter. The way she held her fork with both hands like she was still figuring it out. The way she kicked her feet under the table when she was happy. The way she talked to her pancakes before she ate them. "You ready?" Emily asked, looking down at her stack of 3. For what Robert said, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug. The ceremony. She said it completely seriously, like it was an established tradition, which it was. She had invented it herself about 4 months ago, and Robert had never once questioned it. "I'm ready," he said. Emily cleared her throat, sat up straight, and addressed her plate. "Good morning, pancakes. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your sacrifice." Robert pressed his lips together hard to keep from smiling, because smiling would break the ceremony, and Emily took this very seriously. "You may now be eaten," she announced, and picked up her fork. Robert finally let himself smile, then turning it into the coffee mug so she wouldn't see him be soft about it. But the truth was, moments like this one ridiculous, ordinary, unremarkable moments in a diner on a Tuesday morning were the moments he held on to. The ones he replayed at 3 in the morning, when the house felt too quiet and the other side of the bed felt too wide. He had done a lot of things in his life that required discipline. Operations that required him to stay still for hours in conditions that would break most men. Decisions made in fractions of seconds that he would carry for the rest of his life. He had served with the best and buried some of them. He had come home to a wife who loved him even when he couldn't always explain what was wrong, and he had built a life in Pine Valley that looked from the outside like peace. And then Melissa got sick, and the peace became something he had to fight for all over again, a different kind of fight, quieter, with no training manual. But Emily was here. Emily was 8 years old, and she held ceremonies for her pancakes, and she still grabbed his hand when they crossed the street, even though she was probably old enough not to. And all of that was enough reason to get up every single morning and keep going. He took a sip of coffee and let the diner settle around him. He knew this place the way he knew most places he'd spent time in. Not just the layout, but the rhythm. Betty Gonzalez, behind the counter, who'd worked there for 22 years and knew his order before he sat down. The couple in the corner booth who came every Tuesday and never talked much but always left holding hands. The old man by the door who read the actual newspaper, the paper kind, and sighed at it every few minutes like it owed him an apology. Robert had been coming here for 3 years, since before Melissa passed, since after. It was one of the things that had stayed constant, and he valued constants more than most people understood. "Daddy," Emily said, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah. Do you think pancakes feel pain?" He considered this with complete seriousness, the way she deserved. "No," he said. "I think they feel honored." She seemed satisfied with that and went back to eating. The bell above the diner door jangled. Robert didn't look up right away. He registered the sound, registered the weight of footsteps that followed. Heavy, deliberate, the walk of someone who wanted to be heard. And then he heard the voice. "Betty, tell me you got something better than that burnt garbage from last week." Robert recognized the voice before he saw the face. Pine Valley wasn't a big town. You learned people's voices before you knew their names. Sometimes. Mark Anderson's voice was the kind you learned fast, loud assured in a way that had nothing to do with actual confidence and carrying that particular edge of a man who'd spent years getting his way by making everything slightly uncomfortable for everyone around him. Robert kept his eyes on his coffee. Mark Anderson was mid-40s, thick through the shoulders, the kind of man who'd probably been athletic once and now wore that history like a credential long after it had expired. He owned a landscaping company, employed half a dozen guys he paid as little as he could justify, and held some unofficial social position in Pine Valley that existed mostly in his own head and the heads of the few people who wanted something from him. Robert had seen his type before, had served alongside variations of that type actually, men whose volume substituted for substance. The difference was in the military that type eventually got ground down into something more useful, or they washed out. In civilian life, they just kept being loud until someone or something stopped them. He watched Mark move to the counter, clap his hand on it twice like he was calling a meeting to order, and lean across toward Betty with that particular smile that wasn't really a smile. "We got what we got," Betty said, not looking up from the coffee she was pouring. "What you got is what I'm asking about, sweetheart." Betty set the coffee pot down and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been dealing with difficult men for 22 years and had long since run out of patience for them. "Don't call me sweetheart, Mark. And the special today is the same as it's been every Tuesday for 11 years. If you don't like it, the highway diner's 20 minutes east." Mark laughed like this was hilarious rather than a dismissal. He grabbed a stool at the counter, swiveled on it like a teenager, and let his eyes wander around the room the way some men's eyes do, not looking for anything specific, just asserting a kind of ownership over whatever they landed on. His eyes landed on Robert. More specifically, they landed on Robert's forearm, resting on the table beside his coffee mug. On the tattoo there. Robert felt at the attention without looking up. He had a very finely calibrated sense for when he was being looked at. Occupational necessity once upon a time. "Hey, Mark," called across the diner. Robert looked up. Mark was pointing at his forearm. That military Robert held his gaze steady. "Yes." "What branch army?" Mark made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. Somewhere in between, and shook his head slowly like Robert had told him something mildly disappointing. "Army," he said with a particular kind of inflation on the word that made it sound like a punchline. Robert said nothing. "My buddy did." Army. Mark continued, not addressing anyone in particular now, just talking to the room. Said it was basically just a lot of waiting around and paperwork. No offense. He said the last two words in the tone of someone who meant every offense. "None taken," Robert said, and looked back down at his coffee. Emily was watching the exchange with the sharp, solemn attention of a child who understands more than adults give her credit for. She'd gone very still, the way she went still when something felt wrong, her fork hovering over her pancakes. "Daddy," she said quietly. "Eat your breakfast, Bug," he said just as quietly. Then he caught her eye and held it for a second, and something passed between them, an understanding, a reassurance, and she went back to her plate. Mark had gotten his coffee and a plate of eggs and was eating at the counter, but he kept talking, not to anyone directly, just talking the way some men do when they need the room to be about them. "Place I used to go to in Harrisburg," he was saying to Betty, or anyone who'd listen. "They had real home cooking. Not this." He gestured vaguely at his plate. "Whatever this is." "Then go back to Harrisburg," Betty said flatly. More laughter from Mark. He was enjoying himself. He ate a few bites, drank his coffee, drummed his fingers on the counter. Then his eyes drifted back to Robert's table. "You actually do anything he called over? In the Army, or you one of those guys that just did the training and then sat on a base somewhere?" The diner had gotten quieter, not silent. The coffee machine was still hissing. The couple in the corner booth were still murmuring to each other, but quieter in the way places get when people are paying close attention while pretending not to. Robert looked up again. He kept his voice even. "I served," he said. "That's enough." "Sure, sure." Mark nodded slowly like he was granting something. "Just seems like guys who did anything real would be doing a little better than." His eyes moved around the table, took in the worn jacket hung over the seat back, the practical cheap coffee, the little girl with the syrup on her chin. He shrugged. This. The silence that followed was the loudest kind. Robert felt something shift in the room. He felt the couple in the corner go rigid. He felt Betty stop moving behind the counter. He felt Emily's foot stop kicking under the table. And he felt somewhere very deep and very controlled inside himself. Something else shift too, something old and trained and patient that he had kept carefully locked down for years. He did not let it show. "Mark." Betty's voice came from behind the counter, sharp and warning. "That's enough. What, I'm just making conversation." Mark held up both hands, the picture of innocence. "Yeah, and I'm telling you to make it somewhere else." Mark pushed his plate forward with one finger, a gesture of theatrical offense. "I'm a paying customer, Betty. I got rights. You got a bill," she said, "and I'm happy to bring it." But Mark wasn't done. Something in him had locked onto Robert the way certain people lock onto a target when they've decided they need to make a point. Robert recognized it. He'd seen it before in bars and briefings in foreign countries with no embassy nearby. That particular look of a man who's decided that backing down isn't an option because he's already gone too far in his own head. Mark slid off the stool. He picked up his coffee cup and walked it across the diner like he was just stretching his legs, like he was going nowhere in particular, but he was going somewhere particular. He stopped at Robert's booth. Emily looked up at him with wide eyes. Robert stayed exactly where he was, hands around his mug, shoulders relaxed, eyes level. "No hard feelings," Mark said, which was the thing people said when they were about to try to create some. He nodded at the tattoo again. "What is that anyway? Some kind of, what, special forces thing?" Robert didn't answer. "Because I saw one like it before on a guy at a gun show over in Clinton. He was real proud of it. Kept going on about his unit, his training." Mark paused, crying shame though. The whole tough soldier act. Like, what's the point? You come home and you're still just another look at the table, at Emily, at Robert, just some guy. "Daddy." Emily's voice was very small. "It's okay, Bug," Robert said. His eyes never left Mark's face. His voice was absolutely calm. "Sir," he said, and the word was respectful in syllable only. "I'd appreciate it if you walked back to the counter." Mark tilted his head, smiled. "Yeah? Or what?" Something moved behind Mark's eyes. A flicker of calculation. A decision being made badly. His jaw set. He leaned forward with one hand on the table, bringing his face closer to Robert's level, and lowered his voice in a way that was still completely audible to everyone in the room. "The thing about guys like you," Mark said, "is you think that tattoo makes you somebody. You think you can sit there looking all quiet and hard and people are supposed to just, what, respect you for what, losing? For coming home to nothing?" Robert said nothing. "Your kid's sitting right there," Mark said. "Maybe teach her what it actually looks like when a man handles himself instead of just sitting there taking it." The room was completely still. And then Mark Anderson drew his hand back and slapped Robert Williams across the face. The sound was sharp and clean, and it cut through the diner like something breaking. Emily made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Betty said Mark's name, and Robert Williams, Delta Force veteran man who had operated in 4 countries under conditions that don't appear on any official record, man who had spent years training his body and his mind into the most precise instrument of controlled force that the United States Army knew how to build, sat completely still. But what nobody in that room knew was that Robert Williams wasn't just any veteran. That faded tattoo marked him as one of the most dangerous men in the U.S. military, a Delta Force operator who'd survived missions in places most Americans never heard of, and the restraint he was showing, that was harder than anything he'd ever done in combat. His head had moved with the impact just slightly, just enough to absorb it correctly, and then it came back and his eyes came back with it. And they found Mark Anderson's face with an expression that was not anger. It was something much, much quieter than anger. Mark's smile faltered just at the edges. Just enough. "Try something," Mark said, but his voice had changed. Just a fraction. The bluster was still there, but underneath it something had noticed something. The way an animal notices a shift in the air before the weather turns. Robert looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked down at Emily. She was sitting completely still, her pancakes forgotten, her eyes moving between her father's face and the man standing over their table. And what Robert saw in her face, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that a daughter shouldn't have to feel while having breakfast with her dad on a Tuesday, was the thing that moved in him more than the slap had. He set his coffee mug down carefully on the table. He put both palms flat on the surface and he began very slowly to stand. Later, people who were in that diner would describe it differently. Some would say it was like watching a different person stand up. Some would say it was like the temperature in the room dropped. Some would say they couldn't explain it, only that something about the way Robert Williams rose from that seat made every single person in the room understand on an instinctive level, below language, that something fundamental had just changed. Mark held his ground, or he tried to. Oh, what he said, and now the bravado was working hard. "Now you want to—" Robert's hand came up and caught Mark's wrist in the same motion. Mark had swung, and no one had quite seen when he decided to do it, or when Robert's hand had gotten there. Only that Mark's fist was now stopped in midair, held at the wrist in Robert's grip, and Mark's face had gone from confrontation to confusion in less than a second. "Hey!" Robert's grip didn't tighten. It didn't have to. It just held the way a vice holds completely without effort. Mark tried to pull back. His arm didn't move. "Let go." "Daddy." Emily's voice was quiet. Not frightened. Something else. And Robert looked at her. Really looked at her. The way he had learned to look at the things that mattered most, when everything else was trying to demand his attention. She was looking at him with those eyes. Melissa's eyes, wide and clear and trusting, in a way that reached right through everything he'd ever been trained to do, or suppress, or compartmentalize, and found something underneath all of it that was just her father. He held Mark's wrist for one more beat. Then he released it. Mark stumbled back half a step, catching himself against the neighboring table, his face cycling through confusion and humiliation, and something that might have been, if you looked fast enough, the beginning of genuine fear. Robert looked at him for a moment. Then he sat back down. He picked up his coffee mug. He took a sip. "Emily," he said, his voice entirely even. "Finish your breakfast." The diner held its breath, and Emily Williams, 8 years old, picked up her fork. She looked at her pancakes, and in a voice so quiet that only her father and the people in the nearest booth could hear it, she said, "They're getting cold." "Yeah," Robert said. "They are." From the corner of his eye, he saw Mark Anderson standing there. The man who had walked in swinging his weight around like it was a natural law, who had decided that a quiet man having breakfast with his little girl was the right target for whatever was rotting inside him that day. That man was standing very still, cradling his own wrist and trying to find somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't Robert's face. He couldn't find anywhere. Betty was already reaching for the phone behind the counter. Her eyes met Robert's briefly, and he gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. She paused, reading it the way people who'd known each other long enough could have entire conversations in gestures. But the thing about Pine Valley was that it was a small town, and small towns had long memories, and the sheriff's cruiser that was already turning into the diner's parking lot. Not because anyone had called, but because Sheriff William Garcia ate here every Tuesday morning, same as he had for 11 years, was about to bring its own particular kind of resolution to what had just happened in booth number 4. Robert Williams wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at his daughter's face in the morning light. He had not used anything close to what he was capable of. He had not needed to. That was the point. That had always been the point. The tattoo on his forearm caught the sunlight for just a moment, a design that meant nothing to most people who saw it. That looked like any other piece of military ink to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But to the handful of people in the world who did know the men and women who'd been trained by the same unit, who'd operated in the same shadows, who'd trusted each other with everything in the worst moments imaginable, it said something very specific. It said, this man has already survived things you cannot imagine, and he chose not to. Mark Anderson, standing in the middle of the Pine Valley diner with a humiliation he hadn't seen coming, and a wrist he'd be thinking about for a week, was just beginning to understand what that meant. And outside, the sheriff's car door opened. Sheriff William Garcia had a particular way of walking into a room, not fast, not slow, measured the way men who've spent 30 years reading situations walk. He'd come through the diner door the same way he always did. 2 taps of his boot on the mat outside hat, adjusted eyes moving before the rest of him had fully committed to entering. It was a habit so old he didn't think about it anymore, just the way William Garcia arrived anywhere. He read the room in about 4 seconds. Mark Anderson standing in the middle of the floor, cradling his right wrist against his chest. Betty Gonzalez behind the counter with her hand still hovering near the phone, not touching it but near it. Every other patron in the place either looking at their plates very deliberately or looking at Robert Williams's booth with the careful attention of people who just witnessed something and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. And Robert Williams sitting in booth 4, both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his daughter eating pancakes across from him, like this was any other Tuesday. Garcia had known Robert Williams for 3 years, known him the way you know a quiet man in a small town. Through accumulated observations, through what other people said and didn't say, through the specific quality of the silences he kept. He knew Robert had served, didn't know the details, and Robert had never offered them. And Garcia had been around long enough to understand that the details some men didn't share weren't omissions, they were weight. He looked at Mark first, then at Robert. Then he crossed the diner to the counter, pulled out his usual stool and sat down. "Morning, Betty." Betty stared at him. "Garcia coffee, please." She blinked, set the phone down, reached for the pot, poured his cup and said in a voice pitched low enough that only he could hear it, "You are not seriously going to sit down and have coffee right now. I'm going to sit down, have my coffee and let the room breathe for 60 seconds, Garcia said just as quietly. Because whatever just happened here, it's already done. Nobody's bleeding, and sometimes the best thing a badge can do is not be the first thing in the room. He picked up his cup. Then I'm going to handle it. Betty looked at him for a long moment, then she shook her head slowly and went back to the counter. The 60 seconds was probably closer to 30. Garcia drank his coffee, let the room resettle, watched the body language shift as people registered that law enforcement was present, and the immediate tension of uncertainty had been replaced by a different kind of tension, the kind that comes with authority in the room. Then he stood up, picked up his cup, and walked over to Mark Anderson. "Mark," he said. Mark's head came up fast, and Garcia could see it immediately, the flush in his face, the way his jaw was working, the fact that he was holding his wrist in a way that suggested it wasn't physically injured so much as it was a prop, now something to organize the humiliation around. Mark Anderson was the kind of man who needed a grievance to hold on to when things went wrong. Sheriff Mark straightened. "I want to file a complaint." "This man?" "In a minute," Garcia said. He looked over at Robert's booth. "Robert, you all right?" Robert looked up. Something moved briefly across his face. Appreciation maybe, or recognition of what Garcia was doing by asking him first. "We're fine," he said. "Thank you." Emily Garcia tipped his head toward the little girl. Emily looked up from her pancakes with the solemn gravity she brought to most things. "Good morning, Sheriff Garcia." "Good morning, sweetheart." He looked back at Mark. "Walk with me." "I don't want to walk with you. I want to mark." The single word delivered at the same conversational volume as everything else was enough. Garcia had 30 years of practice making single words land correctly. "Walk with me." Mark's mouth closed. He walked. Garcia led him to a space near the door, far enough from the other tables to have a semi-private conversation close enough that nothing would happen without witnesses. Old habit. "Tell me," Garcia said. Mark told him. The version Mark told was predictably a version in which Mark had merely been making conversation, had perhaps said some things that could be taken wrong, had not meant anything by them, and had then been physically assaulted without provocation when Robert had grabbed his wrist in a manner that could have broken it. Garcia listened to all of it without interruption. Another old habit. When Mark was done, Garcia said, "And the slap." Mark's jaw tightened. "I barely—" The slap, Mark. A pause. He was being disrespectful. To you. To veterans in general, he was making us all look. He was sitting there having breakfast with his daughter, Garcia said. "That's what I'm hearing from everyone else in this room. He was sitting there and you walked over and put your hands on him. He grabbed my, after you hit him." Garcia let that sit in front of Mark. in front of his 8-year-old daughter. Mark didn't answer that. "Here's what I know about Robert Williams," Garcia said, and his voice shifted into something even quieter, something that required Mark to lean forward slightly to hear. "In 3 years I have never had a complaint about that man. Not one. He works, he raises his daughter, he comes in here on Tuesday mornings, and he's decent to people. That's his whole life as far as this town sees it." He paused. "You want to tell me what you were trying to prove?" "I wasn't trying to prove. Because from where I'm sitting," Garcia continued like Mark hadn't spoken, "it looks like you walked into this diner, picked the quietest man in it, and decided to push him until something happened. And I want you to think very carefully about the fact that what actually happened, is that you swung at him, and he stopped it with one hand and he let you go, and he sat back down." He picked up his coffee cup from where he'd set it on the edge of the nearest table. "What does that tell you?" Mark's face was a complicated thing right then. Garcia watched the calculations moving behind his eyes, the anger looking for a direction, the humiliation looking for a target. And underneath all of it, something Garcia had seen in men who'd gotten themselves into situations they didn't fully understand. The beginning of a recalibration. "He should have just talked to me like a man," Mark muttered. "He told you to go back to the counter," Betty called from behind the counter. She was making no attempt to pretend she wasn't listening. Twice. The whole place heard it. Mark shot a look in her direction. "She's not wrong," the old man with the newspaper said from his table by the door without looking up. Garcia watched Mark's face move through something that might in a better man have been the beginning of embarrassment. But Mark Anderson wasn't quite there yet. He was still too far inside his own version of the morning. "I want to press charges," Mark said. "Assault." He grabbed my. "You want to press charges against Robert Williams," Garcia said. "Yes, for stopping a punch after you'd already slapped him. In front of witnesses." Garcia gestured without looking at the room full of people who were all watching with the undisguised attention of a town that had run out of pretending not to look, all of whom I'll be speaking to individually. He took another sip of coffee. "You sure that's the path you want to start down?" The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. At booth 4, Emily was telling Robert something in a low voice. Robert was leaning forward slightly, his elbows on the table, listening to her with the focused attention he always gave her. No distractions, no half-presence. All of him aimed at what she was saying. From across the diner, Garcia couldn't hear the words, but he could see Robert nod and then say something back that made Emily look down at her plate and then back up at her father with an expression that was part reassurance received, part something older than 8 years old had any right to be. That kid had been through a lot, Garcia thought. They both had. Mark was still standing there working through something internally. Garcia waited. He was good at waiting. "What I said," Mark started and stopped about his service. Another stop. "I don't know what he did over there. I was talking." "You were performing," Garcia said. "It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. For the room. And it didn't land the way you thought it would. And then you doubled down because that's what you do." He set his coffee cup down on the table. "Mark, I've known you 12 years. You're not a bad man, but you've got a mean edge when you want an audience. And one of these days, that edge is going to find someone who handles it very differently than Robert Williams did today. And I'm not going to be able to do much about it after the fact." Mark looked up at that. "That man," Garcia said, nodding toward booth 4, "made a choice this morning. A specific, deliberate choice. I don't know his full story, and neither do you, but I know enough about the men who wear that particular ink to understand that the choice he made cost him something, and he made it anyway because his daughter was watching." He picked up his hat, which he'd set brim up on the table. "That's not weakness, Mark. That's the opposite of weakness. And I think somewhere underneath all that noise you were making, you know that—" Mark said nothing for a long time. He looked at his wrist, turned it over. It was fine, not even red. "Am I being arrested?" he asked finally. "That depends," Garcia said, "on whether Robert Williams wants to press charges for the slap, which is his right." He looked over at the booth. Robert looked up. "You want to make this official?" There was a pause. Robert glanced at Emily, who had stopped eating and was watching her father's face with that careful reading attention she had, that way she had of watching him make decisions like she was learning something each time. "No," Robert said. Mark's shoulders came down about an inch. But Robert said, and his voice was even and measured and carried to every corner of the room without being raised, "I'd like him to apologize to my daughter." The room went very quiet again. Mark looked at Robert, then at Emily. Emily looked back at him with Melissa's eyes clear and steady and entirely without performance. Garcia watched Mark Anderson stand there in the middle of the Pine Valley diner with every person in the place waiting, and he watched the calculations run out and leave Mark with nothing but the moment itself. Mark walked to the booth. He stopped about 2 feet back. He didn't look at Robert, or maybe couldn't quite yet. He looked at Emily. "Hey," he said. His voice had lost most of its volume. "I'm sorry for—" He stopped, cleared his throat, "for making a scene while you were having your breakfast. That wasn't right." Emily looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once with the gravity of someone accepting something real. "Okay," she said. Mark stood there for another second like he might say something else. Then he turned and went back to the counter, put enough money down to cover his bill and then some, and walked out of the diner without another word. The bell above the door jangled once and then settled. The room exhaled. Betty poured Garcia another coffee without being asked. The couple in the corner booth resumed their quiet murmuring. The old man with the newspaper turned a page and sighed at it. Somewhere in the kitchen, something was sizzling. Garcia carried his cup to booth 4 and stood at the edge of it. "Mind," he said, nodding at the seat across from Robert beside Emily. "Go ahead." He sat down. Emily scooted toward the window to make room, looking up at him with a particular expression of a child who is processing multiple large things simultaneously and doing it remarkably well. "You doing okay, kiddo?" Garcia asked her. "I'm okay," she said, and then after a beat he was very rude. "He was," Garcia agreed. "My dad was very calm. He was that too." Emily considered her pancakes, which had gone cold. "I think that's harder," she said with the certainty of someone who'd thought about it carefully. "Being calm when someone's mean. I think that's harder than being mad." Garcia looked at Robert. Robert was looking at his daughter with an expression that Garcia would carry with him for a long time. Something about the rawness of it. The way a man's face changes when his child articulates something that took him years to learn. "Yeah, Bug," Robert said quietly. "It is harder. But you did it." "I tried." "You did it," she said again with the definitiveness of 8 years old, and picked up her fork and started eating again. Garcia let the quiet sit for a moment. Then he said to Robert, and not Emily, at a register that was meant for just the two of them, "That tattoo." Robert looked at him. "I've seen it once before," Garcia said. "On a man I served with a long time ago, before I came to Pine Valley, before I had any idea that something like that existed." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. He never talked about it either. Robert held his gaze, didn't confirm, didn't deny, just held it. "I'm not asking," Garcia said. "Just saying I know enough to understand what you didn't do today and what it took not to do it." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's got a daughter too." "Mark. I remember seeing them at the hardware store once, maybe a year ago." She looked about Emily's age. Garcia hadn't expected that. He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "He does." "Men like that," Robert said, and he was choosing his words the way he did everything carefully without waste. "They're usually carrying something. It doesn't make it okay, but it's usually there." "You feeling sorry for the man who just slapped you?" "No," Robert said it simply. "But I don't need him to be a monster for what happened to be wrong." He took a sip of his coffee, which was also cold by now. He didn't seem to notice or mind. "Emily doesn't need to see me treat a struggling man like an enemy. She needs to see me treat a wrong thing like a wrong thing. There's a difference." Garcia sat with that for a long moment. "Robert," he said finally. "Yeah. Is there anything about your situation, yours and Emily's, that you need help with?" "Not about today. Generally. I know you're doing it alone, and I know he stopped restarted. I know this town doesn't always step up the way it should, and I know I don't always ask the right questions." Robert looked at him. Something moved through his face that was brief and complicated, and then settled back into the quietness he kept. "We're all right," he said. "Okay." But Robert started again. "Thank you for asking. Thank you for—" Betty arrived at the table, then unrequested, with a fresh plate of pancakes that she set in front of Emily without ceremony. "On the house," she said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Emily looked at the hot pancakes, looked at Betty. "Thank you, Miss Betty. Don't mention it, sweetheart." Betty turned back toward the counter, and if her voice was slightly rougher than usual, nobody said anything about it. Emily looked at her new plate for a moment. Then she straightened up and cleared her throat and addressed the pancakes with the full gravity of the ceremony. "Good morning," she said to them. "Thank you for being here. We appreciate your sacrifice." Robert pressed his lips together against the smile. "You may now be eaten," Emily announced, and picked up her fork. Garcia looked at Robert Williams over his coffee cup and saw the smile finally break through, real and unguarded, and there and gone in a second. The way smiles are when they come from somewhere that means it. He looked down at his own coffee. 30 years on the job and a Tuesday morning in this diner had just reminded him of something he'd been letting himself forget. That dignity was not a complicated thing. It didn't require an audience or a script or a particular kind of past. It was just the decision made over and over in small moments to be the thing you most wanted your children to see. Outside, through the diner window, he could see Mark Anderson's truck still sitting in the parking lot. Mark was inside it, not moving, just sitting there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Garcia watched him for a moment. He'd go out and check in a minute, not to press anything, just to check. But first he finished his coffee. He listened to Emily tell her father about a book she was reading at school, something about a girl who could talk to horses, and watched Robert listen to her with that total, unhurried attention that was the most expensive gift a parent could give, and thought about the fact that the hardest battles are almost never the ones anyone else sees. Then the bell above the diner door jangled again, and Garcia looked up, and something shifted in the room a second time. A different kind of shifting, quieter but somehow heavier, because the man who had just walked in was not anyone Garcia had been expecting. He was older, maybe 62, wearing a jacket that had the specific functional quality of someone who had never stopped thinking about how they moved in their clothes. His eyes went around the room in the same way Garcia's always did, fast, complete, landing last on booth 4. And the expression on his face when they found Robert Williams there wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Robert looked up, and for the first time that morning, something in his face changed in a way that wasn't controlled. Something that was older than Pine Valley, older than single fatherhood, older than the last 3 years of holding himself together. The man walked to the booth and stopped. He looked at Robert for a long moment, then he looked at Emily. "She's got her mother's eyes," the man said. Robert was very still. "Yeah," he said. "She does. I heard you were here. Took me 3 years to make it. You could have called. I could have the man agreed. But some things you say in person." He glanced at the seat beside Robert, the question in it. Robert nodded. The man sat down. Garcia looked between them, and the texture of what was happening in this booth had shifted into something that was no longer about Mark Anderson or the slap or the morning's particular drama. It was something older, something that had been waiting. He stood up from his seat quietly. "I'll leave you to it," he said, to no one in particular. Robert looked up. "Sheriff Garcia." "Yeah. Thank you for this morning." "Don't thank me," Garcia said. "You handled it." He put his hat on, nodded to the man beside Robert, whose name he didn't know and felt he shouldn't ask, and walked back to the counter where Betty was watching him with raised eyebrows. "You know who that is?" she said quietly as he set down his cup. "No," Garcia said. Betty looked toward the booth. "He was here about 2 years ago, just briefly. Didn't eat. Just asked if a man named Williams came in here regular." She paused. "I told him yes, and I told him Tuesdays." Garcia looked at her. "You never told Robert?" "No." She picked up the coffee pot. "Figured if someone was looking for you, you probably knew them. And if you knew them, they'd find you when it was time." She refilled his cup. "And now it's time, I guess." Garcia looked back at booth 4, where Robert Williams and the man from somewhere in his past and the little girl with her mother's eyes were sitting together in the morning light, and Emily was looking at the stranger with her solemn, measuring attention. And the stranger was looking back at her with an expression that had something in it that wasn't quite sorrow and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the space between those two things. Whatever had walked through that door just now, it wasn't nothing, and it wasn't finished. But Garcia was a man who understood timing, and this wasn't his moment. He drank his coffee, left his money on the counter, always a little more than he owed, always had, and walked back out into the Tuesday morning. Robert looked at the man across from him and said quietly, "Christopher." Christopher Hernandez nodded. "Been a long time, 3 years, give or take." Christopher's eyes moved to Emily, then back to Robert. "She looks just like her." "I know. How have you been?" "Surviving," Robert said. That all Robert considered the question. "Most days." Christopher reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Standard white, unremarkable, except for Robert's name written on it in handwriting he knew. Handwriting he'd recognize anywhere. "Where did you get this?" Robert said, though he already knew the answer before Christopher spoke. "Daniel." The name landed in the booth like a stone in still water. Daniel Lopez had been the best of them, which was saying something. Robert's closest friend for 6 years. The kind of friendship that forms in conditions where you've seen each other at the absolute limit of what a human being can withstand and know exactly what the other person is made of on the other side of it. They'd served together in places that didn't exist officially, done things that would never have official records. And Daniel Lopez had died 18 months ago. Robert knew this. He'd gotten the call. He'd sat in his kitchen in Pine Valley after Emily was asleep and felt the loss of it the way he felt all the big losses now, which was in the body first and the mind second, a physical thing before it became a thought. He reached out and picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. Not yet. He wrote it about 3 months before Christopher said. Knew things were heading where they were heading. He gave it to me with instructions. He paused. The instructions were to deliver it personally, not to send it, to wait until the time was right and take it to Robert myself and make sure he read it with someone present. Christopher looked at him. I waited 1.5 years. I don't know if that was the right amount of time, but I needed to make sure you were somewhere stable before I brought this into it. And Mark Anderson this morning convinced you I was stable, Robert said with a tone that wasn't quite dry and wasn't quite not. Actually, yes, Christopher said entirely seriously. I was watching from the parking lot. I needed to see how you were. Really how you were. Not the version you'd give me if you knew I was looking. He paused. The way you handled that man, Robert. The way you handled it with her right there. That told me what I needed to know. Robert looked at him. You've been watching me since you got to Pine Valley. I've been watching you for about 40 minutes. You could have walked in earlier. I could have, but I wanted to see. Christopher stopped, cleared his throat. Daniel told me that when I brought you this, I needed to be sure you were still you. His words. He said there was a version of you that Pine Valley might get that wasn't the real version. That grief does things. That he'd seen it happen to men who could handle anything except the ordinary. He looked at the envelope. He said if I showed up and you were just surviving, not living, just white-knuckling through it, to wait longer. But if I showed up and you were still leading with the good part, his words, the good part, then it was time. Robert sat with that for a long moment. Leading with the good part. He could hear Daniel saying it. He looked across the counter. Emily was explaining something to Betty using her hands, her whole face animated, and Betty was watching her with the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe how much personality fit in such a small person. He looked back at the envelope. He opened it. The letter was 2 pages handwritten and reading Daniel Lopez's handwriting. After 18 months of its absence was the particular kind of pain that arrives quietly and then expands. The kind you don't try to manage, just let move through. He read it. Christopher sat beside him and said nothing. The diner went about its business around them. And somewhere in the kitchen things sizzled, and outside the Tuesday morning continued, and Robert Williams read the letter his dead friend had written him 3 months before dying. And when he was finished, he set it on the table and looked at the wood grain for a moment. He knew, Robert said. He knew a lot of things, Christopher said quietly. He knew about the offer. Christopher nodded. Robert had been carrying it for 8 months like a stone in his pocket, there for every step, weight redistributed around it but never absent. It had come through channels he'd thought were closed. Someone had reached out through enough layers that the call had arrived looking like nothing significant, just a former colleague checking in. But underneath the social surface of it was a question that had taken 3 conversations to arrive at. And the question was, would he come back, not active service? He was past the window for that, and he knew it and they knew it. But something adjacent, training, consulting institutional knowledge applied in ways that kept his name off documents and his face out of rooms. But his expertise working in the direction of outcomes that mattered. Valuable work. Work that meant something in the specific way that the work had always meant something to him. In the years before Melissa got sick and gravity shifted, he'd said he needed time to think about it. That had been 8 months ago, and he was still thinking, which was its own kind of answer, except that Emily had started 3rd grade and needed someone at pickup every day, and the mortgage on the house in Pine Valley needed paying, and sometimes he woke up at 3 in the morning, not with nightmares, but with the particular specific ache of someone who is very good at something that they are no longer doing. "What does he say?" Robert asked. "About the offer. Read the 2nd page again," Christopher said. "The part at the bottom." Robert looked back at the letter, found the paragraph. Daniel had written, "I know you. I know the part of you that wants to say yes, and I know the part that says the work is done. Both of those parts are right. That's the problem with being a whole person. You have competing truths. But here's what I know that you might not see from where you're standing. The work being different doesn't mean the work being over. You just have to figure out what form it takes. Now, the main job is already in Booth 4 at the Pine Valley Diner every Tuesday morning. Build everything else around that. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you those 2 things can't coexist." Robert set the letter down again. He wrote this before he knew about Melissa, Robert said. Yes. And he stopped, started again. He still talked about Emily like she was the center of it. She was always the center of it to him, Christopher said. You know that. He talked about her every time your name came up. Called her the mission. Christopher's voice was steady but careful, the way voices get when they're moving through something painful that matters too much to let get imprecise. He said you were the kind of man who did everything right on the job and worried he was getting the most important one wrong. He paused. That you might be so afraid of getting it wrong that you're not giving yourself credit for how right you're already doing it. Robert looked at the back of Emily's head, at the counter, at her hair, which needed cutting at the set of her shoulders already, so much like his, at the small hand on the counter turning pages of the book she'd brought. Christopher. I know, Christopher said. I know. I'm not here to push you one way or the other. The offer is not why I came. I came because Daniel asked me to, and because he stopped. Something moved across his face. Something that Christopher Hernandez didn't often let move across his face. Because you and Daniel were the best 2 men I ever served with, and one of you is gone, and I let too much time pass before coming to find the other one, and I'm too old to keep pretending that was okay. The silence between them then was the kind that happens between people who have trusted each other with things that can't be undone. After a moment, Emily came back to the booth. She looked at the 2 of them, at the letter on the table, at her father's face. Are you sad? She asked Robert. A little, he said honestly. Because of the letter. Because of who wrote it. She looked at Christopher. Was he your friend? He was our friend, Christopher said. Mine and your dad's. Did he die? A small pause. Yes, Christopher said. He did. Emily processed this with the particular solemnity she brought to important information. I'm sorry, she said to Christopher. Then she slid back into the booth beside Robert, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and she didn't say anything else, just sat there present and warm and 8 years old. Robert put his arm around her. He felt her lean into it the way she'd been leaning into him since she was small enough to carry. The same trust in the same direction. Christopher watched this. He looked away after a moment toward the window, giving them the privacy of not being observed. There's something I need to tell you, Robert said quietly. Christopher looked back. Yesterday I got an email. No sender, just a photo of Emily at school. Subject line said, "We know where she goes." Christopher's entire body language changed, from relaxed to operator mode in half a second. You still have it. Deleted from server remotely. I tried to trace professional work. Christopher cut in. He pulled out his phone, typed something. How long have you known 36 hours? And you didn't call me Robert quiet. I didn't know if it was real or someone messing with me. Christopher looked at him, and in his eyes was something between frustration and understanding. It's real, he said, and we need to move. Now. Christopher's fingers moved across his phone screen with the efficiency of someone who'd made this exact kind of call 100 times before. Robert, I need you to listen carefully. That email wasn't random. Someone with resources tracked you here, found your routine, identified Emily's school. This is surveillance, not intimidation. Robert's jaw tightened. The diner suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, every patron a potential threat he hadn't properly assessed. How long have they been watching? Long enough to know Tuesday mornings are here. Long enough to photograph your daughter without you noticing. Christopher's eyes moved to Emily, still absorbed in her book. That's professional work. Former military or law enforcement. Someone who knows how we think. We need to get her somewhere secure. Already on it. Christopher typed another message. I've got a contact at Homeland. Patricia Johnson. She'll want to hear about this. Robert looked at Emily. She was humming softly, completely unaware that her entire world had just shifted into a different category of danger. He thought about Melissa, about the promise he'd made in that hospital room. Keep her safe. That was the only job that mattered. Everything else was noise. Christopher stood. We finished this conversation at your place. Not here. Too exposed. Robert nodded. He reached across the table and touched Emily's hand. Bug, we need to go. But I haven't finished. Now, please. Something in his tone made her close the book immediately. She slid out of the booth without argument. Okay, Daddy. They left money on the table. Robert waved to Betty, who was watching them with the particular attention of someone who'd seen enough exits to know when one wasn't routine. Christopher moved ahead, eyes scanning the parking lot before he let them through the door. The drive to Robert's house took 7 minutes. Christopher followed in a rental car, maintaining tactical spacing, checking mirrors. Robert watched Emily in the rear view. She was looking out the window, quiet in a way that meant she was thinking. Is Mr. Christopher staying for a while? Looks like it. Is it because of something bad Robert could lie? He'd gotten good at the small lies that parents tell to protect their children from the sharp edges of the world. But Emily deserved better than that. She always had. Yes, Bug. Something we need to sort out. Okay. Her voice was small but steady. Will you tell me what it is? When I know more? Yeah. I will. She nodded, satisfied with that answer in the way she was always satisfied when he gave her the truth, even when the truth was incomplete. They pulled into the driveway. Christopher was out of his car before Robert had the engine off, moving around the property with the systematic attention of someone conducting a threat assessment. He checked sight lines, noted the neighbor's house 40 yards away, examined the tree line at the back of the property. Inside, Robert set Emily up with her tablet in the living room. Headphones. Okay, I need to talk with Mr. Christopher for a bit. She plugged them in without complaint, already absorbed in whatever video she'd pulled up. Robert and Christopher moved to the kitchen out of earshot, but still within line of sight. Show me the email. Robert pulled out his phone, navigated to his deleted folder. Gone. Server-side deletion. I tried recovery protocols, but whoever sent it knew what they were doing. Christopher took the phone anyway, examined the metadata that remained. Sent at 11:47 p.m. You were asleep. Emily too. So they know your sleep schedule. They've been watching long enough to establish patterns. He set the phone down. Robert, I need you to think. Any operations from your time that could generate this kind of blowback? Anyone with a grudge and the resources to act on it? Robert's mind went back, sifting through years of missions that existed only in classified files and the memories of men who'd been there. Dozens of operations, hundreds of individual actions. Any one of them could have created an enemy with patience and money. Montana, he said finally. 2015. March 18th. Christopher's expression shifted. Brian Thompson. You know about it. I know what's in the after-action reports. Domestic militia federal siege Delta called in when negotiations failed. He paused. You were team leader. It was righteous. Robert's voice carried no doubt. Brian Thompson was planning mass casualty events. Federal building in Missoula State Capitol and elementary school in Kalispell. We had intercepts, financial records, explosives already in place. FBI tried for 11 days. He opened fire first. I'm not questioning the call. But did Thompson have family? A brother? Younger. Kevin. He was 26 at the time. Christopher pulled out his phone again, typed rapidly. Kevin Perez. Changed his last name 4 years ago, his mother's maiden name. He's been off the grid for most of that time, but 6 months ago he started making financial moves. Withdrawals, cryptocurrency, purchases, payments to what look like contractor accounts. He's funding surveillance. Or worse. Christopher looked up. Robert, if Kevin Perez is behind this, he's not looking for an apology. He's looking for blood. And he's patient enough to plan it properly. Then we need to find him before he makes his move. We will. But first we secure Emily. Robert looked through the doorway at his daughter, headphones on, face illuminated by the tablet's glow, completely trusting that her father had everything under control. The weight of that trust was heavier than any gear he'd ever carried into a mission. Christopher made 3 more calls in quick succession. The first was to Patricia Johnson at Homeland Security. The conversation was brief, coded, efficient. When he hung up, his expression was grim. She's mobilizing a team. They'll be here by tonight to set up surveillance and run background on Perez. But Robert, she said something you need to hear. What, this isn't the first time Perez's name has come up. They've been tracking him for 6 months as part of a larger investigation into domestic extremist networks. He's been careful, but he's made mistakes, small ones, enough that they know he's planning something, planning what they don't know yet. But you just became their best lead. The second call was shorter, to someone Christopher didn't name, just coordinates and a timeline. When he finished, he looked at Robert. I've got a safe house option if we need it, 2 hours from here, completely off-grid, but I don't think we're there yet. The third call he put on speaker. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, professional and alert despite the early hour. This is Johnson. Patricia, it's Hernandez. I'm here with Robert Williams. We need to talk about Kevin Perez. There was a pause, the sound of papers being moved. Mr. Williams, I'm glad you're safe. I was going to reach out later today, but since you're already read in, let's talk now. What do you know? Robert leaned toward the phone. I know that 8 months ago someone approached me about consulting work, analysis on domestic terrorism cases. I declined because my daughter needs stability. Yesterday I received an anonymous email with her photo and a threat. This morning Christopher Hernandez showed up with a letter from Daniel Lopez telling me it was time to reconsider that offer. I'm assuming none of this is coincidence. It's not. Patricia's voice carried the weight of someone delivering bad news they'd been preparing to deliver. Mr. Williams, Kevin Perez has been on our radar for domestic terrorism indicators. Financial patterns consistent with operation planning, associations with known extremist facilitators, dark web communications about targeting federal personnel. 2 weeks ago we intercepted chatter that mentioned your name specifically. What kind of chatter? The kind that suggests he's moved from planning to execution. He's hired contractors, at least 2 that we've identified, possibly more. Former military dishonorable discharges, history of working in the gray market. They've been in North Carolina for approximately 10 days. 10 days, Robert repeated. They've been watching us for 10 days. We believe so. And Mr. Williams, there's something else you need to know. The email you received wasn't just a threat. It was a test. They wanted to see how you'd respond. Whether you'd panic, call the authorities, change your routine. You didn't. You stayed calm. That told them something important about you. That I'm still operational. That you're still a threat. Which means they'll adjust their approach accordingly. Robert felt the old training kick in the mental shift from civilian father to tactical operator. It wasn't a comfortable transition anymore. He'd spent 3 years trying to leave that version of himself behind, but Emily's safety wasn't negotiable, and if Kevin Perez wanted a fight, Robert would give him one. What do you need from me? 2 things. First, I need you to say yes to the consulting offer. Not because we're using this situation to pressure you, but because your expertise is the best tool we have to understand Perez's planning process. You know how men like his brother think. You can anticipate his moves. And second, let us bring Emily into protective custody, just for a few days while we locate Perez and his contractors. We have facilities designed exactly for this kind of situation. She'll be safe, comfortable, and you can visit whenever you want. No, Mr. Williams. I said no. Robert's voice carried absolute finality. Emily stays with me. We'll accept protection. We'll coordinate with your team, but she doesn't leave my sight. That's non-negotiable. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I understand. Then we'll bring protection to you. I'm dispatching a team now. They'll arrive by 1800 hours. In the meantime, Christopher, I'm assuming you're equipped to provide immediate security. Affirmative. Good. Keep Mr. Williams and his daughter secured until my team arrives. And Robert, think about what I said regarding the consulting position. We need you. And frankly, you need us. This situation ends one of two ways. Either we find Perez first, or he finds you. I'd prefer the former. The call ended. Robert looked at Christopher, who was already pulling gear from a duffel bag Robert hadn't noticed him carrying. Body armor, communications equipment, and what looked like enough firepower for a small war. You came prepared. I came ready. Christopher handed him an earpiece. Wear this. If anything happens, I need to be able to reach you instantly. Robert fitted it into place, the familiar weight and pressure bringing back muscle memory from operations he'd tried to forget. How long have you been planning this? Since I got Daniel's letter. He told me you'd need support when the time came. I just didn't know it would be this kind of support. Daniel knew about Perez. He knew you'd made enemies. That's the cost of doing what we did. He also knew you'd try to handle it alone because that's who you are. So he made me promise that when I delivered his letter I'd stay. Not just for a conversation, for as long as it took. Robert felt something in his chest tighten. Daniel had been gone for 18 months, but he was still trying to protect him. Still trying to make sure Robert didn't carry more weight than one man should have to carry. Emily appeared in the doorway, headphones around her neck. Daddy, I'm hungry. It was barely 10 in the morning, but normalcy felt important. Food felt important. Okay, Bug. Let's make lunch. Can Mr. Christopher eat with us? Christopher looked at Robert, a question in his eyes about whether they should maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Robert nodded slightly. Yeah, he's staying for a bit. They made sandwiches together. Emily chattering about her book, about a friend at school, about whether clouds were made of the same stuff as cotton candy. Christopher participated in the conversation with surprising ease, asking follow-up questions, treating Emily like a person rather than a child who needed to be talked down to. But his eyes never stopped moving. Window to door, door to window, checking angles and sight lines with the automatic awareness of someone who'd spent too long in places where inattention meant death. After lunch, Emily wanted to go outside. The backyard, she specified very seriously. I need to check on my garden. What garden? The one I planted last week. Remember? The seeds. Robert didn't remember, but he nodded like he did. That parenting trick where you filled in the gaps from context. Okay, 15 minutes. Christopher went out first, did a perimeter sweep, checked the fence line. When he gave the all-clear nod, Robert led Emily through the door. She ran to a small patch of dirt near the back fence where indeed several small green shoots were emerging from the soil. They're growing! She knelt down, examining each one with intense concentration. This one's taller than yesterday. Robert stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric of her shirt. This was what mattered, this moment. His daughter discovering that things she planted could grow. The rest of it, Kevin Perez, the contractors, the threat hanging over them like a storm that hadn't broken yet, all of that was background noise to this. Christopher's voice came through the earpiece, quiet and urgent. Movement in the tree line, north side, could be nothing. Robert's hand tightened on Emily's shoulder. Bug, let's head back inside. But I want to... Now, please. Her face showed the beginning of an argument, but something in his expression stopped it. She stood up, brushed dirt from her knees, and walked toward the house without protest. Robert followed, maintaining himself between her and the tree-line hand, hovering near the concealed carry holster he'd put on after Christopher's arrival. Inside, Christopher was at the window with binoculars. "Dear," he said after a moment. "Young buck, maybe 2 years old, but we're on edge and that's good. Stay sharp." Robert nodded. Pulse still elevated, adrenaline making everything too bright and too loud. This was what the next few days would be like. Every sound a potential threat, every movement requiring assessment, and Emily in the middle of it, trusting him to keep the monsters at bay. She was looking at him now with those eyes that missed nothing. Is something wrong? He could lie, should lie, but he'd promised her the truth when he had it. "Someone's been watching our house. Mr. Christopher and I are making sure we're safe." "Watching why?" "Because of work I used to do, before you were born. Some people are angry about decisions I made back then. Were they good decisions?" Robert thought about Brian Thompson, about the elementary school in Kalispell that would have been a massacre site if they hadn't acted, about the federal workers and state legislators who went home to their families because Delta Force had stopped a domestic terrorist before he could execute his plan. "Yeah, Bug, they were good decisions, but that doesn't mean everyone agrees." Emily processed this with her characteristic seriousness. "Well, if they were good decisions, then those people are wrong to be angry. It's not always that simple." "Seems simple to me." Christopher made a sound that might have been a laugh. "She's got a point." The afternoon passed in tense quiet. Robert tried to maintain normalcy. Emily's homework, a show on the tablet, snack time at 3, but his attention was divided. Half on his daughter, half on the windows and doors and possible approaches. Christopher had taken up position where he could monitor both the front and back of the house laptop, open to what looked like satellite imagery of the surrounding area. At 4:30, Robert's phone rang. "Patricia Johnson." "Mr. Williams, my team is 30 minutes out. I need you to confirm that your location is still secure. Christopher ran a perimeter check an hour ago. Nothing since then except a deer." "Good. When my team arrives, we'll establish a proper security perimeter and conduct a full threat assessment. They'll be with you until we locate Perez and his contractors. I'm also sending over the consulting contract paperwork. I need you to review it tonight. We start work tomorrow morning if you're willing." "What kind of work?" "Analysis of Perez's financial patterns. Communication intercepts known associates. We need you to think like his brother would have thought. Help us anticipate his next move." Robert glanced at Emily, who was coloring at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in keeping the lines neat. "If I do this, what's the timeline?" "If we're lucky, 72 hours, if we're not a week. But every hour Perez is out there is an hour he's planning. I'd rather we find him than wait for him to make his move. Send the paperwork." The team arrived at 5:15, 3 vehicles, 6 agents in tactical gear. Patricia Johnson herself came with them, a woman in her late 30s with the bearing of someone who'd spent significant time in the field before moving into coordination roles. She shook Robert's hand. "Mr. Williams, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I." She knelt down to Emily's level. "And you must be Emily." "I'm Patricia. I'm going to be working with your dad for a few days to make sure everything stays safe and boring." Emily looked at her with that evaluating gaze that made adults uncomfortable. "You're a police officer. Something like that? Federal agent? Homeland Security? That's different from FBI." Patricia smiled. "A little bit. We handle different kinds of problems. The kind where people watch houses? Exactly that kind." "Okay." Emily went back to her coloring. "As long as my dad doesn't have to go anywhere without me." Patricia stood up, met Robert's eyes. "Smart kid. She doesn't miss much." The agents worked quickly, establishing surveillance equipment, setting up communications protocols, conducting a full security sweep of the property. By 6 p.m., Robert's house had been transformed into something resembling a tactical operations center. Monitors showing camera feeds, encrypted communications equipment, enough firepower stored in the spare bedroom to hold off a small army. Emily took it all in stride, asking questions about the cameras, wanting to know if she could see herself on the monitors. One of the agents, a younger guy named Kenneth Lee, showed her how the feeds worked, let her wave at different cameras and watch herself on screen. She thought it was the coolest thing ever. Robert stood in his kitchen watching federal agents move through his home and felt the last 3 years of carefully constructed normalcy dissolving. This was who he'd been trying not to be. This version of himself that dealt in threats and contingencies and tactical responses. But Emily needed this version right now. She needed the operator, not just the father. Christopher appeared beside him. "You doing okay?" "Define okay." "Fair point." Christopher handed him a cup of coffee Robert didn't remember anyone making. "Patricia wants to brief you on what they've learned about Perez. Are you ready for that? Does it matter if I'm ready?" "Not really." She's in the dining room. Patricia had spread files across the table. Photographs, financial records, communication intercepts. Robert sat down across from her. Christopher taking up position by the door. Kevin Perez, 32 years old. Born Kevin Thompson in Detroit, changed his name to his mother's maiden name in 2020. His brother Brian was his primary family connection after their father left when Kevin was 6. Brian essentially raised him. She slid a photograph across. Kevin, at maybe 18, standing next to Brian outside what looked like a compound in Montana. Both of them armed, both wearing tactical gear, both looking at the camera with expressions that mixed defiance and certainty. Brian radicalized Kevin partially. But Kevin also had his own journey. Smart kid, actually. Nearly a 4.0 in high school, full scholarship to Michigan State for computer science. Dropped out after a year when Brian moved to Montana and started building the militia. So he chose his brother over his future. Family loyalty is powerful, especially when one member positions themselves as the only person who understands you. Patricia pulled out another document. After the Montana operation, Kevin went into a denial phase. Spent 2 years trying to build a legal case that Brian was entrapped, that federal agents had provoked the violence. Filed FOIA requests, hired lawyers, even tried to get congressional hearings. All of it went nowhere, because Brian opened fire first, because the evidence was overwhelming. Brian Thompson was planning mass casualty events and the federal government stopped him. But Kevin couldn't accept that. So he shifted strategies. She spread out financial records. 2019 through 2021, Kevin was obsessed, tracking down everyone involved in the Montana operation. He got names from leaked databases, from sympathetic sources, inside contractor firms, from public records. He built a target list. Am I the only one on that list? You're the priority. Team leader, final decision maker. The face he can attach to his brother's death. But there are others. Christopher's on there. Daniel Lopez was on there before he died. Robert's chest tightened. Daniel knew someone was tracking him. We all did. It's part of the cost. The cost of what? Doing the right thing. The cost of making hard decisions that other people have the luxury of judging from safety. Patricia's voice carried no bitterness, just statement of fact. Kevin Perez has the luxury of believing his brother was a martyr. We have the burden of knowing what would have happened if we hadn't acted. She pulled out recent photographs, surveillance images of 2 men. These are the contractors we've identified. Jason Ramirez, former Army MP dishonorably discharged for selling classified information. Scott Hill, former Marine, other than honorable discharge for assault. Both have history in the private security sector, both willing to work outside legal boundaries. Where are they now? We don't know. They were in Pine Valley as recently as yesterday based on tower pings from their phones. But they went dark this morning. Turned devices off or destroyed them, because they knew you were onto them, or because they're about to move. Robert studied the photographs. Jason Ramirez looked like someone trying to hold on to military bearing after the military had decided he wasn't worth keeping. Short hair, rigid posture, even in the surveillance photos, the particular expression of a man who blamed everyone but himself for his failures. Scott Hill was different. Rougher edges, less pretense at professionalism. The kind of person who'd washed out of the Marines because he liked violence more than discipline. These are the men watching my daughter. These are the men Kevin Perez hired to provide surveillance and tactical support. What they're willing to actually do depends on how much he's paying them and how desperate they are. Christopher leaned forward. What's the threat assessment, kidnapping, direct action? Both are possible. Perez's communications suggest he wants Robert to understand what was taken from him. That implies prolonged interaction, not a quick hit. But if his contractors get spooked or things go wrong, they could default to violence. Robert thought about Emily asleep in her bed, about the window in her room that faced the backyard, about how easy it would be for someone with training to get past inadequate locks and basic alarms, about how much trust she put in him to keep her safe. What do you need me to do? Tonight, read these files. Understand Kevin's pattern of thinking, his communication style, his methodology. Tomorrow morning, we'll go through intercepts and financial data. I need you to tell me what he's planning and when he's planning to do it. And if I can't, then we wait for him to make the first move and hope we're fast enough to stop it. That's not an acceptable option. Patricia met his eyes. Then help me find a better one. The briefing lasted another hour, covering operational security protocols, communication procedures, evacuation plans, if the situation deteriorated. By the time it ended, Robert's head was full of contingencies and threat matrices and the specific vocabulary of people preparing for violence. Emily was asleep on the couch tablet, still playing a cartoon at low volume. Robert picked her up carefully, feeling how much heavier she'd gotten in the last year, how she didn't quite fit in his arms the way she used to. She stirred but didn't wake, just pressed her face against his shoulder with that complete trust that children have in their parents. He carried her to her room, laid her down, pulled the blanket up. The nightlight cast familiar shadows on the wall, the same shadows that had been there every night since they'd moved to this house. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. But downstairs there were federal agents monitoring camera feeds and running threat assessments, and outside there were men who wanted to hurt his daughter because of decisions he'd made before she was born. He bent down, kissed her forehead. "I've got you, Bug. Nobody's getting through me." In the kitchen, Christopher had made fresh coffee. Patricia's team had established a rotation schedule. 2 agents on monitors at all times, 2 on perimeter patrol, 2 sleeping. Military efficiency applied to civilian protection. "How does it feel?" Christopher handed him a mug. "Being back in it. Strange. Like wearing old clothes that don't fit quite right anymore. You'll adjust. I'm not sure I want to adjust." Robert took a drink, bitter and hot. "I spent 3 years becoming someone else. Someone who makes pancakes and helps with homework and doesn't think about threat vectors and kill zones. You were never someone else. You were always both. You just tried to pretend half of you didn't exist. Melissa wanted you whole." Christopher's voice was gentle but firm. "I knew her, Robert. Not as well as you did, but well enough. And I know what she told Daniel before she got too sick to talk. She said she was worried you'd try to amputate yourself, cut away the parts you thought she wouldn't want. She was afraid you'd make yourself smaller to fit some idea of what a father should be." Robert stared at the coffee. "What else did she say?" "That Emily needed all of you. The soldier and the father, the protector and the teacher. That trying to be only one thing would make you less, not more." The kitchen was quiet except for the low murmur of agents talking in the next room. Outside, Pine Valley was settling into evening, completely unaware that in this one house on this one street, people were preparing for something that might turn violent. Robert thought about Daniel's letter, about the line he'd read 3 times already. "The main job is already in booth 4 at the Pine Valley Diner every Tuesday morning. Build everything else around that." He'd spent 3 years thinking that meant he had to choose, be a father or be an operator, build a quiet life or do the work he was trained for. But maybe Daniel had meant something different. Maybe he'd meant that Emily was the center, and everything else, including the skills and training and experience that made Robert dangerous, could orbit around her without diminishing her importance. Maybe being whole meant accepting that he could keep his daughter safe precisely because of what he'd been not, in spite of it. The night passed in shifts. Robert tried to sleep but found himself staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet movements of agents changing watch, the electronic chirp of communications equipment, the occasional murmur of voices coordinating something he couldn't quite hear. At 3 a.m. he gave up. went downstairs. Patricia was at the dining room table, laptop open, files spread around her. She looked up when he entered. Couldn't sleep. Not really. Join the club. She gestured at the chair across from her. Want to make yourself useful? Always. She turned the laptop so he could see. Perez's financial transactions over the last 6 months. We've identified most of them payments to the contractor's equipment purchases, travel expenses, but there's one transaction that doesn't fit the pattern. She highlighted a line. $48,000 to an LLC registered in Delaware. No clear business purpose, no obvious connection to his operation. Shell company. That's what we thought initially. But when we traced it, the LLC owns a property, rural Montana, about 50 miles from where Brian Thompson's compound was. Robert leaned closer. He bought property near where his brother died. Bought it 4 months ago. The timing suggests it's operational, not sentimental. You think he's using it as a staging ground or a destination. If his plan involves taking you somewhere isolated, somewhere with significance to his brother's death, that property makes sense. Robert thought about Emily, about what Kevin Perez might be planning, about the kind of revenge that wasn't satisfied with quick violence, but needed ritual, needed prolonged suffering, needed the victim to understand exactly why they were being punished. We need to check that property. Already ahead of you. I've got a team flying to Montana in the morning. They'll conduct surveillance, see if anyone's been using it. And if Perez is there, then we bring him in, and this ends. Robert wanted to believe it would be that simple. But men like Kevin Perez, men driven by ideology and grief and the absolute certainty that they were right, didn't end simple. They ended with blood, or they didn't end at all. Patricia closed the laptop. Get some sleep, Robert, real sleep. Tomorrow we work through his communication intercepts, and you tell me what his brother would have done in his position. His brother would have come here himself. Brian Thompson was hands-on confrontational. He'd want face-to-face, but Kevin's not his brother. No, Kevin's patient. He's been planning this for 7 years. That's not passion, that's commitment. He'll wait for the perfect moment, the perfect conditions. He'll want everything to be exactly right before he moves. That gives us time, or it means we won't see him coming until it's too late. Robert went back upstairs, checked on Emily again. She'd kicked off her blanket, was sprawled across the bed in that completely unself-conscious way children sleep. He pulled the blanket back up, made sure the window was secure, made sure the monitoring equipment Patricia's team had installed was functioning. Then he went to his own room, lay down on top of the covers, and closed his eyes. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of Montana and elementary schools, and an 8-year-old girl asking him why people were angry about good decisions. Morning brought coffee and tactical briefings, and the specific routine of people preparing for something undefined but urgent. Emily woke up to find federal agents in her kitchen and took it with the resilient pragmatism of children who've learned that adults sometimes do strange things. "Can I have pancakes?" Robert looked at Patricia, who nodded. We maintain as much normalcy as possible. So he made pancakes while agents monitored communications, and Christopher did another perimeter sweep, and Patricia coordinated with her team in Montana. Emily performed her ceremony with complete seriousness, thanking the pancakes for their sacrifice, and Robert found himself grateful for the ritual, for the reminder that some things remained unchanged even when everything else was shifting. After breakfast, Patricia set him up at the dining room table with a laptop and headphones. Communication intercepts from Kevin Perez over the last 3 months, mostly encrypted, but we've broken enough of it to establish patterns. I need you to listen and tell me what you hear. Robert put on the headphones. The first recording was scratchy, low quality, pulled from what sounded like a voice-over IP call. Kevin's voice was younger than Robert expected, more measured. Not the ranting of an extremist, but the careful planning of someone executing a long-term strategy. The surveillance package is in place. Subject maintains consistent routine. Vulnerability windows identified. A second voice. Rougher, probably Jason Ramirez. You want us to move on those windows? Not yet. I need to confirm other assets are in position. This only works if we control all variables. Robert paused the recording. He's micromanaging. That means he doesn't fully trust his contractors. Patricia nodded. Keep going. The next recording was more recent, dated 3 days ago. Kevin's voice had an edge to it now, stress breaking through the careful control. Williams received the message. No response yet. No change in pattern. That's good, isn't it? The third voice, probably Scott Hill, means he's not spooked, or it means he's better trained than we thought. Military training doesn't leave especially Delta. He's assessing planning. We need to assume he knows we're here, so we accelerate no. We stick to the timeline. Sunday night. Church youth group. The daughters expose the fathers predictable. We take her then. Robert felt ice in his chest. They were planning to take Emily at church. This Sunday, 3 days from now. He pulled off the headphones. They know about church. Patricia was already typing. What exactly did you hear? Robert repeated the conversation verbatim, his memory pulling up every word with perfect clarity. Patricia's expression tightened. Sunday night youth group. Does Emily attend that every week? 6:30 to 8. The church has a poorly lit parking lot, limited cameras, multiple exit routes. It's a good tactical choice. Then we adjust. Either Emily doesn't go or we turn it into a trap. Robert thought about his daughter, about using her as bait, about the kind of father who'd allow that. No trap. She doesn't go. We find another way to draw them out. Robert, if we change your pattern now, they'll know we're onto them. They'll adjust, go to ground, and we lose our advantage. I don't care about advantage. I care about Emily's safety. And the best way to ensure her long-term safety is to end this. We control the environment, we flood the zone with agents, and when Perez's contractors make their move, we take them down. Clean surgical finished. Christopher had been listening from the doorway. She's right, Robert. We can make it safe. Safer than waiting for them to find a better opportunity. I'm not using my daughter as bait. You're using your daughter as the reason we end this, Christopher corrected. There's a difference. Robert looked at Emily in the living room playing some game on her tablet, completely unaware that adults were discussing whether to put her in a controlled danger zone. The thought made him physically ill. But Christopher was right, and Patricia was right. If they didn't force Perez's hand now, he'd wait for a better moment, a moment they couldn't control. And Robert would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day his luck ran out. Okay, he said finally. But I'm there. On site, armed, ready to move if anything goes wrong. Agreed. Patricia was already pulling up maps of the church grounds on her laptop. We have 3 days to plan this. Let's make sure we get it right. The next 3 days moved with the particular rhythm of preparation, intense bursts of planning followed by empty hours of waiting. Patricia's team mapped every inch of Pine Valley Baptist Church and its surrounding grounds, identifying 17 potential approach vectors and 32 positions where agents could maintain overwatch without being obvious. The parking lot became a tactical diagram on her laptop, colored zones, marking safe areas and danger points, evacuation routes highlighted in red. Robert spent those hours studying Kevin Perez the way he'd once studied high-value targets in operational theaters. Not just the facts-born Detroit computer science dropout brother killed in federal raid, but the spaces between facts. The way grief could metastasize into obsession. The way intelligent people convinced themselves that revenge was justice. The way 7 years of careful planning could create a person who was simultaneously patient and desperate. Emily went to school each day with 2 agents maintaining loose surveillance. She had no idea they were there. Robert watched the camera feeds from Patricia's mobile command center, tracking his daughter's movements across the playground, through the cafeteria, into classrooms. Seeing her through the lens of threat assessment made everything sharper and more terrible. Every stranger became a potential contractor. Every vehicle in the school parking lot required verification. Thursday afternoon, Patricia received confirmation from her Montana team. The property Kevin had purchased was active. Recent tire tracks, evidence of temporary structures, signs that multiple people had been using it as a staging area. But no one was there now. Whatever Perez had planned for that location, it was waiting for something. For someone. For Emily. We need to talk about what happens if they take her. Patricia laid out the scenario with clinical precision. If despite all our precautions they manage to grab Emily. What's your response? Robert's jaw tightened. I go get her. That's not a plan, that's an emotion. I need to know I go get her, Robert repeated. With or without your support. With or without authorization. I will find where they take her, and I will bring her back. Christopher, who'd been silent through most of the planning sessions, spoke up. He means it, Patricia. And before you say it's not policy, remember who you're talking to. Robert spent more time behind enemy lines than most of your agents have spent in the field. If they take Emily, policy stops mattering. Patricia looked between them, calculation moving behind her eyes. Then we make absolutely certain they don't take her. Friday. Robert sat Emily down for a conversation he'd been dreading. They were in her room, door closed, speaking in the quiet voices people use when they don't want to be overheard. Bug, I need you to understand something about Sunday. She looked up from the book she'd been reading, gave him her full attention in that way that made her seem older than 8. Okay. We think the people who've been watching the house might try to do something at church, during youth group. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't panic, didn't cry. She absorbed information the way she always did, seriously, carefully looking for what she needed to know. What kind of something they might try to take you away from me. Not because they can, but because they want to try. And we're going to make sure they can't. How there are going to be a lot of people there who look like regular church members, but who are actually working with me and Mr. Christopher and Miss Patricia. They're going to keep you safe. But I need you to remember something very important. What Robert took her small hand in his. If anything feels wrong, if anyone you don't know tries to talk to you or asks you to go with them, you say no. You say it loud. And you find me immediately. Don't be polite. Don't worry about being rude. Your safety is more important than manners. What if I can't find you? Then you find the nearest adult you recognize and you tell them you need help. And you keep saying it until someone listens. She nodded slowly, absorbing this. Are you scared? The question caught him off balance. He could lie, should lie, but they'd built their relationship on truth, even difficult truth. Yeah, Bug. I'm scared, but you're still letting me go. I'm not letting you go alone. I'll be there the whole time. And so will a lot of people whose job is to keep you safe. But I won't lie to you, there's risk. And if you want to skip youth group this week, we can do that. Emily considered this with the seriousness she brought to important decisions. If we skip, will the bad people go away eventually, but it might take longer, and you'd be worried the whole time. I'm already worried. Then we should do it Sunday, she pronounced with finality. Because waiting just means being scared longer. Robert pulled her into a hug, feeling her small frame against his chest, her heart beating steady and strong. When had she become this brave? When had she learned to face fear instead of running from it? You're tougher than I am. Bug, I learned it from you. Her voice muffled against his shoulder. You're always scared, but you do things anyway. That's what brave means. Saturday morning brought a development that shifted everything. Patricia's team intercepted a communication from Jason Ramirez to Kevin Perez. The encryption was better this time, took them 4 hours to crack, but when they did, the message was clear. Target is aware. Unknown how much. Recommend abort and reassess. Kevin's response came 20 minutes later. No abort. Timeline accelerated. Move Sunday as planned, but expect resistance. If opportunity becomes risk, transition to contingency. Robert read the transcript 3 times. What's the contingency? We don't know, Patricia admitted. But transition to contingency in tactical language usually means a backup plan that's more aggressive than the primary. They're going to try something else if the church grab fails, or if they think the church grab is compromised before they attempt it. Christopher was studying the satellite imagery of the church grounds. Robert, if they know we're on to them, they might not wait for Sunday. They could move tonight, tomorrow morning, any time they think gives them an advantage. Then we stay ready. Robert pulled on the body armor Patricia's team had provided, checked the sidearm he'd been carrying since Thursday. 24/7 alert until this ends. The rest of Saturday passed in hypervigilance. Every car that drove past the house got logged and identified. Every phone call to the house got recorded and traced. Emily sensed the tension, even though the adults tried to hide it, became quieter, stayed closer to Robert, asked fewer questions. That evening, Christopher pulled Robert aside. "You need to sleep. Real sleep. If something happens tomorrow, you need to be sharp. I can't sleep knowing they might move tonight. Then let me take first watch. I'll wake you if anything changes." "But Robert, you're running on fumes." "I can see it. Emily can see it." Robert wanted to argue but knew Christopher was right. The exhaustion was catching up with him, making his reactions slower, his thoughts less precise. That kind of degradation got people killed. 4 hours, he conceded. "But you wake me if there's even a hint of movement. Deal." Robert lay down in his clothes weapon within reach, door open so he could hear any change in the house's rhythm. Sleep came harder than it ever had in the field because in the field he'd only been responsible for himself and his team. Here, one floor down, Emily was sleeping with absolute trust that her father had everything under control. He dreamed of Montana, of Brian Thompson raising his rifle, of the split-second decision that had started this whole chain of consequences. In the dream he hesitated, in the dream that hesitation cost lives. He woke to Christopher's hand on his shoulder, pulse racing, ready to move. "Easy. It's still dark. Nothing's happened. But I need you to see something." They went downstairs to where Patricia had multiple screens running. One showed thermal imaging of the area around the house, 2 heat signatures just beyond the tree-lined stationary for the last 90 minutes. Could be hunters, one of Patricia's agents offered. Deer season. At 2 in the morning, Christopher's skepticism was warranted. In position with sight lines to this house, Patricia made a decision. Donald Kenneth, full tactical gear. We're going to politely ask those hunters what they're hunting. The 2 agents moved with practiced efficiency, disappearing into the night with thermal optics and suppressed weapons. Robert watched the screens tracking their movement through the woods, approaching the heat signatures from 2 directions with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this before. The radio crackled. "Contact. 2 males, tactical clothing, long-range optics aimed at the house. They're running. Pursue and detain." Patricia's voice was calm, non-lethal if possible. What followed was 3 minutes of controlled chaos, agents moving through darkness, thermal signatures fleeing the crackle of updates over radio. Then Kenneth's voice, slightly breathless. "One detained, other disappeared into heavy cover. We lost him. Can the detained identify negative? No ID, no wallet, no phone. But he matches the description of Scott Hill." The one they brought back was indeed Scott Hill, zip-tied and radiating hostility. Patricia's team set him in a chair in the dining room, agents on either side, recording equipment running. "You're on private property conducting surveillance with what appears to be tactical equipment," Patricia began. "That's a felony. Want to tell me who you're working for?" Scott's response was a variation on "go to hell" delivered with creative profanity. "Okay. Then let me tell you what I know. You're Scott Hill, former Marine, dishonorably discharged for assault. You've been in North Carolina for 2 weeks working for Kevin Perez. And right now your partner Jason Ramirez is somewhere in those woods trying to figure out if he should run or complete the mission." Scott's expression flickered surprise that they knew so much, then calculation about how much to admit. "I want a lawyer. You'll get one. Eventually. But right now you and your employer are planning to kidnap a federal witness's child. That's not just state felony, that's federal terrorism charges. 25 years minimum." Patricia let that sink in. "Or you can cooperate. Tell us where Perez is, what the plan was when you were supposed to move. Give us everything and maybe you walk away from this with a future." Scott's mouth worked. He looked at Robert, recognition dawning. "You're Williams." Robert stepped closer. "Where's Kevin Perez?" "Go ask your friend Lopez." "Oh wait, you can't. Because he's dead." The provocation was obvious, designed to make Robert lose control, do something that would compromise the interrogation. Robert felt the anger, acknowledged it, set it aside. Daniel's death wasn't this man's fault. He was just a tool Kevin was using. Daniel died doing what he believed in. Robert kept his voice level. "You're sitting here because you were willing to hurt a child for money. Those aren't equivalent." Something in Scott's face shifted. "I wasn't going to hurt her. I was just surveillance. Surveillance that would enable kidnapping. That makes you complicit." Scott looked away. I needed the money. That's all. It was supposed to be easy, watch the house report movement get paid. But it escalated. Christopher spoke from the doorway. Perez kept changing the plan, adding requirements, pushing for more aggressive action. And you went along with it because the money kept getting better. Scott didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was admission enough. Patricia leaned forward. Last chance, Mr. Hill. Where is Kevin Perez right now? A long pause. Then I don't know. Truth. He never told us his location. Everything was through encrypted messages, dead drops for equipment, cryptocurrency for payment. I've never seen him face to face. What about Ramirez? Jason might know more. He was point of contact. But he didn't share everything with me. When were you supposed to grab the girl tomorrow night? Church parking lot, 7:45 p.m. Jason was supposed to create a distraction at the front entrance while I approached from the rear. Grab her, use chloroform, get her to a vehicle stage 2 blocks away. And then I was done. My contract ended with delivery to a location in Montana. The property Kevin purchased. Scott blinked. How did you? We've been 3 steps ahead of you since you arrived. Patricia cut him off. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going into federal custody, charges pending your level of cooperation. And we're going to use your communication protocols to tell Kevin Perez that his plan is still active. No. Scott's face showed genuine fear for the first time. If Kevin finds out I talked, he'll what? He's not going to be in a position to hurt anyone. Patricia's tone allowed no argument. You chose this path, Mr. Hill. Now you get to help us finish it. The rest of the night was spent crafting a message from Scott to Kevin carefully worded to suggest everything was proceeding normally while actually giving Patricia's team the information they needed. The message went out at 5 a.m. Surveillance team relocated due to LEO activity in area. Primary plan still viable. Confirm execution timeline. Kevin's response came 30 minutes later, terse and cautious. Confirm you're secure. They'd anticipated this Kevin testing whether his contractors were compromised. Patricia had Scott record a short video message, nothing that would give away his current situation, just enough to prove he was still operational. Secure. Awaiting confirmation. Another delay, longer this time. Kevin was thinking, assessing, deciding whether to trust the communication. Finally his response. Execute as planned. 2000 hours. Confirmation required within 30 minutes of success. Patricia looked at Robert. He's committed. Tomorrow night he expects his contractors to deliver your daughter to Montana. Then tomorrow night, we end this. Sunday morning felt suspended in amber, every minute stretching longer than it should, every sound amplified, every shadow requiring assessment. Emily woke early, found Robert already dressed and alert in the kitchen. She climbed into his lap without speaking, just pressed herself against him, small and warm and trusting. Are we still going to church? If you want to? Do you think the bad people will really try? I think they might try. And I think we'll stop them. She was quiet for a moment. Daddy, why do they want to hurt me? I didn't do anything to them. This was the question Robert had been dreading. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that she'd become a proxy for adult conflicts she couldn't possibly understand? They don't want to hurt you because of anything you did. They want to hurt you because of something I did. A long time ago, before you were born. And they think hurting you will hurt me, which will make them feel better about losing someone they loved. That's stupid. Robert almost smiled. Yeah, Bug. It is. If you could go back and not do the thing that made them angry, would you? He considered Brian Thompson about the schools and government buildings that would have been massacre sites, about the families who went home whole because Delta Force had intervened. No. What I did saved a lot of people, including kids your age. But that doesn't make their anger less real. So sometimes you have to make people angry to do the right thing. Sometimes. And then you have to live with the consequences. She considered this. I think you're brave. I think you are too. They sat like that until Christopher came in with coffee, until Patricia called with final preparations, until the morning progressed toward the moment they'd all been preparing for. The church service at 11 was surveillance theater. Robert and Emily sat in their usual pew while Patricia's agents filled surrounding seats dressed as normal churchgoers, armed and alert beneath casual clothing. Christopher was in his balcony with sight lines to all exits. 2 more agents were positioned outside watching approach routes. Emily participated in everything normally, singing hymns, listening to the sermon, whispering questions to Robert about words she didn't understand. To anyone watching, they were just a father and daughter at Sunday service. But Robert's hand never strayed far from the concealed weapon at his hip, and his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging faces and positions and potential threats. When the service ended, they filed out with the rest of the congregation. The parking lot was full of families heading to Sunday lunch, children running ahead of parents, the ordinary chaos of post-church departure. Patricia's team maintained position, watching for anything abnormal, anyone who didn't fit the pattern. Nothing happened. No contact, no suspicious vehicles, no sign of Jason Ramirez. They went home to an afternoon that felt endless. Emily tried to read but kept glancing at the clock. Robert tried to maintain normal routine but found himself checking weapons and reviewing tactical plans every 20 minutes. At 5 p.m., Patricia gathered everyone for final briefing. Youth group starts at 6:30. Emily needs to be there by 6:45 at the latest. We'll have 12 agents on site, 8 inside the church in various positions, 4 outside maintaining perimeter. Robert, you'll be in the fellowship hall with the other parents. Christopher, you're on overwatch from the 2nd floor. Any questions? What about Jason? Robert asked. If Scott was detained, Jason knows something's wrong. That's why we think he'll move tonight. He's got no support, no backup, but he's committed to the job. And men in his position tend to go forward rather than retreat. They can't admit failure. Emily appeared in the doorway dressed for youth group, carrying her Bible and workbook. I'm ready. The drive to the church took 10 minutes convoy style, with Patricia's vehicle ahead and Christopher's behind. Emily sat in the back seat looking out the window, humming something under her breath that might have been a hymn or might have been nervous energy. You okay, Bug? Yeah, just thinking. About what? About how after tonight things might go back to normal. No more people watching the house, no more worrying. Just us again. Robert met her eyes in the rearview mirror. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about too. The church parking lot was already filling with families, teenagers carrying guitars and Bibles, the casual chaos of a Sunday evening youth program. Patricia's agents were scattered throughout, maintaining their covers, parents dropping off kids, church volunteers setting up equipment, a maintenance worker doing something with the exterior lighting. Robert walked Emily to the entrance, hyper-aware of every person around them, every vehicle, every shadow. At the door, she turned and hugged him. I'll see you in an hour and a half. I'll be right inside. Anything feels wrong, I know, Daddy. Find you immediately. She went in, joining a cluster of other kids disappearing into the fellowship hall where the youth group met. Robert watched until she was out of sight, then moved to his assigned position, a corner where he could monitor both the main entrance and the hallway to the fellowship hall. Christopher's voice came through the earpiece. All stations check in. One by one, Patricia's agents confirmed positions. Everyone was in place. The trap was set. Now they waited to see if Jason Ramirez would walk into it. 6:45 passed, 7 o'clock. The youth group was in full swing, music and laughter filtering through the walls. 7:15. Robert's muscles were beginning to ache from sustained tension. 7:30. Movement at the northwest corner. Kenneth's voice calm and professional. Single adult male approaching on foot, checking surroundings. Matches description of Ramirez. Visual confirmed Christopher from his overwatch position. He's armed, right hip concealed carry. Let him approach. Patricia ordered. We take him when he commits to entry. Robert watched through the window as Jason Ramirez moved across the parking lot with the false casualness of someone trying to look natural while conducting surveillance. He paused near a cluster of parked cars, glanced at his phone, oriented himself toward the fellowship hall wing. He knows where Emily is, Robert realized. He's done enough reconnaissance to know exactly where the youth group meets. Jason moved toward the building's rear entrance, the one that would put him closest to the fellowship hall with the fewest witnesses. But as he reached for the door handle, Patricia's voice cut through the comms. All units take him. Now. 4 agents converged from different directions, fast and coordinated. Jason's hand went to his weapon but never cleared the holster. Kenneth hit him from the left, Donald from the right, and within 3 seconds, Jason Ramirez was face down on the pavement with zip ties securing his wrists. Package secured. Patricia confirmed. Robert, keep Emily inside. We need to clear the scene before she knows anything happened. But Emily had heard something, the commotion, the sudden movement outside. She appeared in the fellowship hall doorway looking for her father, with that expression children get when they know something's wrong but don't know what. Robert moved to her immediately. Hey, Bug, everything's okay. What happened? Some adults needed to have a conversation outside. Nothing for you to worry about. She looked at him with those eyes that saw through incomplete truths. Did they catch the bad person? Robert glanced at Patricia, who nodded slightly. Yeah, they caught him. Emily absorbed this, then surprised him by asking, Can I see him? What? Why would you? Because I want to know what someone looks like who wants to hurt me. I want to see that he's just a person. There was a logic to it that Robert couldn't quite argue with. The unknown is always scarier than the known, and maybe seeing Jason Ramirez as just a man caught, defeated, no longer a threat would help her understand that dangers could be overcome. He looked at Patricia again, question in his eyes. She considered, then nodded once. Okay, but we don't get too close and we don't stay long. They walked outside where Patricia's team had Jason sitting against the church wall, secured but not hurt. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by failure and capture. Emily stood beside Robert, studying Jason with intense concentration. Why did you want to take me? Jason looked at her, surprised to be addressed directly by the target he'd been planning to kidnap. His face cycled through responses, defiance, shame, calculation, before settling on something like resignation. Because someone was paying me to. But why me specifically? Jason glanced at Robert. Because of what your father did. To someone this other person cared about. Did my father do something bad? No. Jason's answer came with unexpected honesty. He did his job. People died because they needed to die. I've read the reports. It was a righteous action. But the man who hired me doesn't see it that way. Because he loved the person who died. Yeah, because of that. Emily thought about this, then asked the question that mattered most to her. If you had taken me, would you have hurt me? Jason was quiet for a long moment. Then I told myself I wouldn't. That I'd just be moving you from one place to another. But the truth is, once I took you, I wouldn't have controlled what happened next. So yeah, maybe, probably. That was honest. It's all I've got left. Patricia stepped in. That's enough, Emily. Let's get you home. But Emily had one more thing to say. She looked at Jason with that serious expression she brought to important moments. My dad says sometimes you have to do hard things to do right things, and that the people who get angry about right things are usually carrying something that hurts. I think you must hurt a lot to do something this bad for money. Jason's face did something complicated. He looked away, mouth working. Kid, you're smarter than I deserve. On the drive home, Emily was quiet, absorbing what she'd seen and heard. Robert let her sit with it, didn't push for conversation. Sometimes the most important things needed space to settle. Finally she asked, Is it over now? Not quite. We still need to find Kevin. He's the one who hired those men. But Emily, the part where you were in danger, that's over. You're safe now. Because you kept me safe. Because a lot of people kept you safe. Mr. Christopher, Miss Patricia, all those agents. But yeah, I did my part. She leaned against him, small and warm and alive. Thanks, Daddy. The weight of her trust, the simple gratitude in those 2 words hit Robert harder than anything else that had happened. This was why he'd come back to operational work. This was why accepting Daniel's message about wholeness mattered. Because keeping Emily safe required all of him, the father and the operator, the teacher and the protector. Back at the house, Patricia's team was already coordinating with their Montana counterparts. Jason Ramirez had given up Kevin's location within 20 minutes of enhanced interrogation, not torture, just the methodical application of consequences and options. Kevin was at the property he'd purchased, waiting for a delivery that would never arrive. The Montana team moved at dawn Monday, surrounding the property in the pre-light darkness, establishing perimeter, confirming heat signatures inside the main structure. When they breached at 5 a.m., Kevin Perez was alone, sitting at a laptop monitoring news feeds for any report of a successful kidnapping in North Carolina. He surrendered without resistance, not because he was a coward, but because without his contractors, without his target, without the revenge he'd spent 7 years planning, there was nothing left to fight for. Patricia called Robert at 7 a.m. with the news. "We have him. Federal custody, initial charges filed. It's over, Robert. What happens to him now?" "That depends on him. We're offering a deal, full cooperation testimony against his network of facilitators, psychiatric evaluation and treatment. In exchange, reduced charges, possibility of eventual release. And if he doesn't take it, then he spends the next 30 years in a federal facility for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and domestic terrorism." "What do you think he'll do?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I think Kevin Perez has spent 7 years building a narrative where his brother was a martyr and you were a murderer. That narrative is all he has left. Accepting the deal means accepting that his brother was wrong, that his entire crusade was based on a lie. That's a hard thing for people to do. But he might do it. He might. Especially if we show him the alternative, that Brian Thompson's plan would have killed children. That the elementary school in Kalispell had 67 students under age 10 on the day Brian had targeted it. That every one of those children went home to their parents because Delta Force stopped a domestic terrorist. Show him the cost of his brother's ideology. Show him the lives your decision saved. Sometimes facing truth is the only path to healing." Robert hung up and stood in his kitchen for a long moment, listening to the house wake up around him. Emily's footsteps upstairs, Christopher making coffee, the ordinary sounds of Monday morning. 2 days later, Patricia called again. Kevin had accepted the deal. Full cooperation. 18 months. Mandatory psychiatric treatment testimony that would help dismantle the network of extremist facilitators who'd enabled his planning. It wasn't justice in the pure sense Kevin would eventually walk free, but it was accountability. It was a man choosing to face what his brother had really been instead of living in comfortable delusion. Emily took the news with her characteristic pragmatism. "So, the bad people aren't going to try anymore. They're not bad people anymore. They're just people who made bad choices and are now dealing with what comes after. That's a big difference." "Yeah, Bug. It is." Life began settling back toward normal, though normal meant something different now. Patricia's team dismantled their equipment and departed, leaving behind only a direct number for Robert to call if he ever needed assistance. Christopher stayed an extra week, helping Robert establish proper security protocols, teaching Emily some basic awareness skills disguised as games. On his last morning, Christopher found Robert in the kitchen making coffee. "You did good, both in the operation and after. Daniel would be proud. I keep thinking about what Emily said to Jason Ramirez, about people carrying hurt. She's wise beyond her years. She's had to grow up faster than she should have. Maybe. But she's also resilient, and she has a father who shows her both strength and compassion. That's rare, Robert." I accepted the consulting position. Robert hadn't planned to say it, but it felt right to tell Christopher first. 2 days a week, remote work helping Patricia's team analyze domestic terrorism patterns, building profiles, identifying radicalization indicators, preventing the next Kevin Perez before he gets 7 years into planning. "That's good. Really good." Christopher smiled. "You found the balance." Daniel's letter was right. Build everything else around Booth 4. Exactly like he said. Robert looked out the window at Emily, who was in the backyard checking on her garden, talking to the plants with the same seriousness she brought to everything. Yeah, exactly like he said. The Tuesday after Christopher left, Robert and Emily returned to Pine Valley Diner. Same booth, same time, same ritual. Betty brought coffee without being asked, set a fresh pot on the table with a knowing smile. "Heard you had some excitement." "Nothing we couldn't handle." "That's what I figured." She refilled his cup. "Good to have you back." The pancakes arrived. Emily cleared her throat, sat up straight, and began the ceremony. but this time with new words Robert had never heard before. "Good morning, Pancakes. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your sacrifice, and we promise to make today worth it." She picked up her fork, looked at Robert with satisfaction. "That's the new part. We promise to make today worth it." Robert felt something shift in his chest. Pride and love and the overwhelming gratitude of a man who understands exactly how lucky he is. That's perfect, Bug. That's exactly right. They ate their breakfast together in Booth 4 at Pine Valley Diner on a Tuesday morning in a small North Carolina town that believed itself ordinary. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of threats and responses of men planning violence and other men working to stop them. But inside, in this moment, there was just a father and daughter sharing pancakes and making promises about the day ahead. Sheriff Garcia came in at his regular time, saw Robert and Emily, nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose town had survived something difficult without ever knowing how close it came. He took his usual seat at the counter, ordered his usual coffee. The bell jangled again. Robert looked up automatically, that operational awareness that would never fully leave him. But it was just a family, parents and 3 kids, the youngest bouncing with the energy of children promised pancakes. A normal family. A Tuesday morning. Life continuing. Robert thought about Brian Thompson and the 67 children at Kalispell Elementary who were now teenagers because of a decision made on a March afternoon in Montana. He thought about Kevin Perez sitting in a federal facility, finally beginning to understand what his brother had really been planning. He thought about Daniel's letter, about the line that had changed everything. "Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you those two things can't coexist." Emily finished her pancakes, pushed the plate away. "Ready to go, Daddy?" "In a minute." Robert flagged Betty for the check, left cash on the table with the usual generous tip. Emily slid out of the booth, grabbed her backpack, waited patiently while he stood. They walked to the truck together, Emily's hand in his, the morning sun warming their backs. Tomorrow he'd start his first consulting assignment for Patricia's team, analyzing financial patterns of a militia group forming in Michigan, preventing the next tragedy, stopping the next Kevin Perez before 7 years of obsession turned into violence. But today was Tuesday, and Tuesday meant diner breakfast and checking Emily's garden and reading together on the porch swing while the afternoon stretched long and lazy. At home, Emily went straight to the backyard. Robert followed, watching her kneel beside the small patch of soil she'd claimed, examining each green shoot with focused attention. "This one grew since yesterday." She pointed to a tomato plant that was now maybe 4 inches tall. "And this one has flowers." He knelt beside her, looking at the garden through her eyes, seeing not just plants but possibility, not just seeds taking root but evidence that good things could grow from careful tending. "You're doing great with this, Bug. Think we'll actually get tomatoes if you keep taking care of them." "Yeah, absolutely." She smiled, that bright, uncomplicated joy that children have before the world teaches them to doubt. "Then I'll keep taking care of them." They stayed in the garden until Emily decided the plants had been sufficiently checked on. Then they went inside, washed dirt from hands, settled into afternoon routine. Emily reading on the couch, Robert working at the kitchen table on his laptop, the house quiet except for the comfortable sounds of 2 people existing together in peace. His phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Michigan assignment briefing scheduled for 0900 tomorrow. Looking forward to working with you again." He replied simply, "Confirmed." Another text, this one from Christopher. "How's the Bug?" Robert smiled. "Thriving. She's got a garden now." "Of course she does. Tell her I said hello." "Will do." The afternoon passed into evening. They made dinner together. Emily's turn to choose, so spaghetti with the sauce she liked that was too sweet for Robert's taste, but he ate it anyway because her joy in making it was worth the compromise. After dinner, dishes, homework, the evening routine that had become ritual. At 8 o'clock bedtime. Emily brushed teeth, changed into pajamas, climbed into bed with the book she was reading. Robert sat on the edge of her bed the way he did every night. "Love you to the moon, Bug," and back she completed their exchange, then added something new. "Daddy, thanks for keeping me safe. Always. That's the job." "I know, but I wanted to say it anyway." He kissed her forehead, turned on the nightlight that she probably didn't need anymore but hadn't asked to stop using, stood in the doorway watching until her breathing evened into sleep. Then he went downstairs. Checked doors, checked windows, checked the security system he'd installed with Christopher's help. Pour a small bourbon, sit on the porch in the darkness. Listen to Pine Valley settling into night. The night was quiet. Just crickets and distant traffic and the particular peace of a small town that believed itself safe. Robert considered all the small towns that weren't safe about the militia groups and extremist cells that Patricia's team was tracking about the work he'd be doing to identify them before they got to the point where federal intervention became necessary. Preventive work. The kind that didn't make headlines because success meant nothing happened. But it mattered. It saved lives that would never know they'd been in danger. He finished the bourbon, went inside, locked up, headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new threats to assess and prevent. But tonight was quiet. Tonight everyone he loved was safe and close and whole. Robert lay in bed considering Melissa about what she'd told Daniel before she got too sick, that she was worried he'd try to amputate himself, cut away the parts he thought she wouldn't want, that Emily needed all of him. She'd been right, as she usually was. He was whole now. Father and operator, teacher and protector, the man who made pancake ceremonies and the man who stopped domestic terrorists. Not separate roles, but integrated facets of the same person. It had taken 3 years and a threat to Emily and Daniel's letter and Christopher's friendship and Patricia's faith in him to get here. But he'd arrived. Sleep came easier than it had in months. No dreams of Montana or missed shots or consequences that spiraled into tragedy. Just darkness and rest and the sound of Emily breathing steadily in the next room, safe and whole, and his.